Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hey everyone, and welcome to Raising Parents, the Parenting Science Insights podcast, produced by Ellen Massell, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Dina Sargeant. Let's get started. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode. Now, as parents, it is part of our role to get children involved in the world and to understand situations involving political engagement, from attending protests to questioning why things are the way that they are. Joining me on the show today is author, psychologist, and professor at Georgetown University, Dr. Fathali Moghaddam. Thank you so much for joining me on the show, Fathali.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Now, for those who don't know, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into talking about the importance of political engagement?
Well, I was trained as a psychologist. I received all my formal training in England, and I was young and adventurous. And in 1979, the revolution in Iran was taking place. And I rushed back thinking that this was a wonderful opportunity to help my country of birth move forward towards democracy. And I stayed there for 5 years researching and trying to help things move forward. But unfortunately, the challenge of overcoming the extremism that is in that region, not only in Iran, was too much, and I left feeling rather defeated. But I certainly became much more interested, engaged in the whole issue of socialization and politics, how young people become engaged in politics, and what kinds of political orientations they adopt, where they get their ideas from. And so from that time, I've been really searching the same issues and trying to address the same questions, and it continues.
Well, thank you so much for introducing yourself, and that's such a great introduction into our topic today. Before we discuss it further, I would love to get to know some of your recommendations as well as some of your interests by playing our channel's favorite little icebreaker. Now, hopefully this will get us warmed up and ready to answer questions. So to start off with, what is the most recent book that you've read?
Hamlet.
Oh, wow. Okay. Is there a particular reason?
Hamlet. Yes, I reread Hamlet every year.
Okay.
And I usually do it at the start of the academic year.
Oh, wow. Is there a particular reason you start it every year now?
Well, I think it's very good to set ourselves high standards. And Shakespeare is one of the authors I think is at a very high standard. I could be reading Ferdowsi or maybe Moliere, but I think Shakespeare sets a very high standard. And I encourage young people to do the same, to read something that sets them a standard and move from there.
No, that's very true. And I haven't read Hamlet, but I have read Taming of the Shrew, and that was the absolute perfect definition as to description as how my sister and I are our personalities. And so I felt like I personally resonated with that very deeply in terms of the dynamic that both of the sisters really held with each other.
Wonderful, yes.
Yes, so I should add Hamlet to my list. If you recommend it, I'll take your word for it.
Definitely. I've also written a book called Shakespeare and the Experimental Psychology, which I the first book of Shakespeare's I address is Hamlet. So that's a psychological approach to Hamlet.
Oh wow. Okay. There's a lot more in Hamlet than I originally thought then.
Oh, absolutely. It is a book you can read again and again and again and learn something from every time.
Okay, well, I will definitely go and add that to my list of books I need to get now.
Very good.
Now, when it comes to movies, do you have a movie that you would recommend to our viewers today?
Well, lots of movies. For example, the director of In the Heat of the Night just passed away. And I think that's one of the brilliant movies that I would recommend.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I haven't seen that. I may have, but I don't recognize film titles as obviously as I do the characters in them. So I will definitely go and give that a look after the show because that sounds what's the synopsis of the film?
The main theme is race relations in America and power relations in America. And it's a film that stars Sidney Poitier, among other people. And he plays a detective from the north of the United States, and he happens to end up dealing with a case in the South. And race relations in the North and South come up, and it's a very well produced and well acted film about issues that are still with us. We haven't overcome them yet.
Okay, no, I will go and have a look at that film. It sounds really interesting. It definitely a movie that is pretty much up my alley in terms of the genre that I would like to see. Now, when it comes to podcasts, do you have a podcast that you could recommend to us today?
Not one, no. There's so many that, that are very good. But I would say it's just wonderful to have this medium right now, and so much is being produced that is worth listening to.
Yes, okay. That's a perfect answer to that.
But I would also add that we, as a psychologist, I would say it's much easier to listen to podcasts that are in agreement with us. So perhaps listen to people who are more controversial sometimes.
Okay. Okay, I will take that advice, and that is pretty good advice for I mean, when it comes to people you look up to as well, I think. Is there a person that you find yourself looking up to that has either challenged you or maybe agreed with some of your views?
Well, I think in my area of work, people like Putnam, who has now retired, but wrote wonderful, provocative works like Bowling Alone or Our Kids, or someone like Daniel Kahneman, who made us rethink the way we decision make. So these people are certainly worth rereading and thinking about, yes. And also, I would say there are some classic novelists that I reread. Mary Ann Evans, who wrote under the name of George Eliot.
Okay.
I think is just one of the few people writing in English who could be comparable to Tolstoy.
Oh wow. What was her name again? Mary Ann
Evans. But she writes under the name of George Eliot.
Okay.
Because in her time in the mid-19th century, she couldn't publish as a woman. She would write her books under the name of a man.
Oh wow. No, that's it's very interesting when you sort of see that um, that issue take place, especially when you know that definitely times have changed now, and you're going into so many different female authors that can go under their own name. Um, yeah, no, it's a very interesting issue that sort of deals with the expansion of how society is today.
Yes, it also highlights a puzzle. And the puzzle is, how is it that in the 19th century, when women had so few rights and they were really deprived politically, economically, in every way, how is it that we get Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters and George Eliot and all these really world-class writers? How did they manage to do it? How did that brilliance come through? That is a puzzle to me.
Yes, no, especially since they were able to sort of go through with their own name and use their own name and make that name stand out rather than make another male's name stand out as well. Yes, no, I definitely agree. And I know when it comes to parenting that everyone has a very different definition into what parenting means and what being a parent would stand for. To your expertise, and even in personally as well, do you have a definition for parenting?
Parenting is part of the family unit. We mustn't forget that. And it is the family in different shapes that has been the building block of society, human society, in our evolution. In one way or another, in different shapes, the family has been the building block of human societies. And parenting has been part of that. Now, we mustn't get too rigid here because the family and parenting can vary quite considerably across cultures. And within one society, just look at parenting in the United States. We can have two males or two females. We can have a male and a female as the parents. We can have all kinds of combinations. And if you go across cultures, then the combinations become even greater. For example, in Shiite Islam, you can have a man and 4 permanent wives and many temporary wives. There are cultures where one woman will have multiple husbands. And one form of that is fraternal polyandry, which is one woman having multiple husbands who are all brothers. So when we say parenting, we have to remember that you can have quite a lot of variation as to what a parent is and what parents are and what a family is.
Yeah.
So for me, the key thing is that parents provide love and support and nurture the next generation. Now, there's quite a lot of variation in what we mean by love and support and what parents mean by raising the next generation. So there's parenting styles, and they vary quite considerably within cultures as well as across. And there's a lot of psychological research on parenting styles.
Yes. No, that's very true. So when it comes to the way that you've defined parenting, what do you think that a lot of expectant parents would need to be aware of during their transition to being a parent?
The first thing to be aware of is that you're going to be surprised. And you're not going to be in control the way you imagine you will be. And so, to some extent, you have to go with the flow and just do your best as things move along. And a great deal depends on who is around you and what support system you have. Because one of the characteristics of modern societies, of course, is that there is greater geographical mobility. People move away from their own parents to raise their own children, and so they're not always able to call on the extended family to help support their parenting. So they have to be flexible and ready for surprises. And then we get into the different styles of parenting. And one thing to do for expecting parents or new parents is to reflect back on themselves and ask themselves, what kind of parenting style do I have? What would I like to do? What am I able to do? And think about this reflectively.
Okay. No, that's a very true point. I think especially when you come to expectant parents, you sort of focus so much on reading the books on how to be a parent that you forget, okay, this is the parenting style that I grew up with. Do I want to keep that, or is there some things that I want to change? Are there things that I liked about my own childhood that I want to keep, or the things that I didn't like that I want to adjust, or make sure that you deal with that mentally before you can really go ahead and be parents?
Yes. And a point that is raised by what you've said is this assumption that I know the parenting intentions of my own parents.
Mm-hmm.
This assumption that, oh, I know how my father and mother raised me and what they were trying to do. And I believe that's often a false assumption.
Mm-hmm.
You try talking to your parents and asking them about, well, what kind of parenting style did you try to achieve? First of all, they'll probably forget most of what they did. Second, often they'll come up with surprises because you'll say something like, well, you were doing this, and they'll say, no, we weren't. And you'll have disagreements about what they were doing. So this idea that, oh, we look back to the parenting style we experienced and think about, okay, am I going to reproduce that? Am I going to question that? Well, for a start, we don't necessarily remember well from our childhood what happened. And it may be that our parents were not intending certain things and we thought they were. Mm-hmm. So this kind of miscommunication is very clear and comes up a lot.
Yes, no, that's very true. And I think one of the big aspects, and it's one of the big aspects that has really affected me growing up, is being aware of what's going on in the world and being aware of how I can be a participant in the world, not just politically, but also as a social aspect of it as well. And I remember growing up that the amount of protests that I went to and was exposed to at a very young age, the amount of discussions that were had when it comes to different issues that are going around, not just in the world, but also in like local government or local situations that have really affected how I see the world today. So when it comes to democratic values that sort of taken, I really want to start off by defining what democratic values would be.
Well, democratic values for me begin with the ability to begin any engagement, interaction, with the acknowledgement that I could be wrong.
Okay.
So when I'm interacting with you, I have to begin that interaction with the acceptance that I could be wrong in my position. And therefore, I have to be open to learning from you. Now, that sounds like a very simple thing, but I believe it is the cornerstone of democracy. Mm-hmm. And parents who are fundamentalists or extremists, either politically, religiously, or otherwise, they cannot begin interactions with this admittance that they could be wrong. They begin with the position that I am right, anybody who disagrees with me is wrong, and there's no other way. Mm-hmm. And this is part of what we call authoritarian parenting.
Okay.
And it's not just an individual difference between parents. There are differences across societies. Some societies raise people to become authoritarian parents. That is much more likely. Mm-hmm. And this is where there is a link between parenting and governing at the federal level, at the national level.
Okay.
So I see a link between national politics and politics within the family.
Mm-hmm. Okay. No, that's really interesting. I've never really connected the two before. And I think especially when you're talking about the idea of how you define democratic values. So it's very important to be open-minded when having those discussions within the family.
Yes, it's very important to be open-minded, starting with this possibility that I could be wrong. And another aspect of the democratic values within the family that I would advocate is that authority can be questioned. So parents have to be open to children questioning them and providing explanations to children. Now, I mentioned authoritarian parenting, mm-hmm. which I see to be parenting where there is rigidity. The parent determines what's going to happen and will not tolerate questioning and will not provide explanations for why certain things need to happen. So the child is told to do something without a justification or explanation, and it's you do it or get punished. So the child does it because she or he doesn't want to get punished. Okay. Whereas in what is called authoritative as opposed to authoritarian, mm-hmm. authoritative parenting, the child is set certain boundaries and is provided with explanations for why those boundaries are there. So, for example, Jane is told you have to be home by 11 o'clock on Saturday, even though you're 16. You have to get home by 11. And the reason is this. So explanations are provided, and Jane can question and debate. Mm-hmm. That's a very important part of authoritative parenting, providing boundaries. But another key difference between authoritarian and authoritative parenting is that in authoritative parenting, some freedom is given to the child to set boundaries for herself or himself.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that the parent comes in and says, you have to do exactly what I say in every area. No, in certain areas, the child can do what they want. They set their own rules. And that's important, to allow them to set rules for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So when you're talking about the parenting styles and you're talking about the elements of family, there is a huge connect when it comes to the outside world as well, and how they're supposed to perceive the outside world. So in a way, if you think about it, that means that the way that the family dynamic works, it sets the expectations for how the child will expect the outside world to be.
Absolutely. There is a link between relationships within the family and how the child learns to have relationships within the family, and the kinds of relationships that develop outside. Now, after the Second World War, one of the key questions that psychologists were asking was, how could the Nazis have got to power in an advanced country, culturally, technologically, scientifically advanced country such as Germany? What kinds of parenting led to this kind of behavior? And a great deal of research began after the Second World War into families that give rise to authoritarian personalities.
Mm-hmm.
And that research has continued in different ways up to now. And it was assumed, and I think it's a correct assumption, that there is a link between the type of family politics that are ongoing and the kind of politics that go on at the national level. So the idea was there would be, when you have a dictator such as Hitler, parallel to that, you have relationships within families that are dictatorial. And within these dictatorial families, you will have the socialization of children who grow up to be authoritarian. Now, fortunately, it doesn't cover all families. There are variations. But the idea was that when you have a dictatorship, it doesn't stop at the boundaries of the family. Mm-hmm. Now, I've had opportunities to really study this process and observe it in dictatorships. And it seems to me that some families manage to set up a little shelter where they protect the children from the dictatorship and its influence. But it's very, very difficult to do that. Within a dictatorship, the dictatorship's influence, its tentacles, tends to reach into the family and influence relationships, and relationships within the family become corrupted, become very difficult. This is done in different ways. For example, if you look at extreme cases such as Stalin's Soviet Union or Khomeini's Iran, or extreme case of dictatorship, children are actually used as ways of spying within the family. Okay. So parents become guarded about the kinds of information they provide their own children, because they know when the child goes to school, the child is going to be cross-examined about what happens at home. Mm-hmm. This kind of corruption by the state is something that's very difficult to protect against. because the parents find themselves constantly within these kinds of dictatorships telling the child, don't tell them at school what's going on at home. Don't ever mention this at school. Don't ever mention this outside the home. So the child lives in two worlds. You could have even 6, 7-year-old children living in two worlds where they know they have to keep certain types of information inside the home and never divulge what happens outside the home. Because if they do, their own family will be in trouble.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really interesting. And it's really difficult to sort of, even for a child to separate what's going on at home and what's going on in the outside world, and try not to let those two worlds collide in a sense. So when it comes to, and I think we were mentioning this before, when it comes to the idea of being open-minded when it comes to the discussions at home, the discussions family, what long-term impact can that kind of upbringing have on a young adult's involvement in politics?
I think it can have quite a profound involvement, because if the parents encourage the child to debate and to question, the child will continue that style of behavior in school and in the larger society. And the hope is that this is how you develop democratic citizens, that these are going to be citizens who will be more engaged. But remember, teaching young people to critically ask questions is of central importance, but you also have to have a political atmosphere outside the home that allows that and allows it to flourish. It's very difficult if you have a culture within a home where they encourage involvement and questioning, and then the child goes outside the home and finds that when she or he questions authority, they react very negatively.
Mm-hmm.
So this has to happen not just in the home, but also outside the home. And I've researched in societies where there are parents who are themselves wanting to encourage their children to be critical thinkers, but they know when the child goes outside, if the child practices critical thinking with the authorities, the child will end up in trouble. Mm-hmm. So this is a very problematic area. And unfortunately, in the United States, it's becoming very difficult as well, because you have these two extremes now opposing one another, and there is developing this atmosphere of non-critical thinking when the two extremes are active.
And especially when it comes to, I guess, the two opposing sides also not really having democratic values that you're trying to instill in children as well. There's also that conflict of, okay, the child is allowed to say something, but if he says something to the wrong person, then that person can get into trouble, or they can get into trouble. Or I know, for example, like going into schools is a very big thing, because if the child finds that one of the rules that the teacher has set isn't a fair rule, if they're growing up being open-minded, they're growing up with the belief to question authority in a difficult sense as well, that can get them into trouble.
Yes, that's where the child needs parental support and parental advice about how to think about rules.
Mm-hmm.
How do you identify a rule as unfair? So that the parent has to think with the child and provide help and answer.
Mm-hmm.
But we also have to get very careful with respect to two things. One is children have to learn that education is not a democracy. It's not a democracy in the sense that teachers, educators, parents have more experience than, for example, a 12-year-old child, and should be the ones providing guidance. So there are certain things that the child will learn to trust, will learn to say, oh, the adults know better, because it's not a democracy where we vote and the majority get their way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one aspect of it. Another important aspect of it is that children have to learn critical thinking to move towards a situation where they can themselves evaluate and identify the correct path. Now, I'm hoping the correct path for them will become the democratic path. So that's my bias. We also are mindful that in this era, we are in an age of rights. I've referred to it as the age of runaway rights.
Okay.
Think about social movements, women's rights, black rights, gay rights, animal rights. We're now giving the environment rights, the rights of the environment. Nature has rights. Notice that nobody marches under the banner of duties. You don't see people walking around with a banner saying, we want our duties. We all march under the banner of rights. I want my rights. We've moved into a culture where rights are the priority, and the question arises, for every right, is there a corresponding duty?
Mm-hmm.
If I have a right to free speech, do I have a duty corresponding to that right? Well, I think I do. I have a duty to listen to you
Mm-hmm.
so that you can practice your right to free speech.
Yeah.
But what we're getting slightly wrong right now is that all of us are emphasizing our rights, but we're tending to forget our duties.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a very good point. And that's one of the first things that I sort of remember when I did civic studies back in high school was there was a course that was called Rights and Responsibilities. And she used the example of saying you have a right to a clean environment, but you also have a responsibility to keep the environment clean. So she was talking about littering and how, okay, we have the right to have a clear space for us to be, but also we have that responsibility of to making sure that we keep that space clean. And it's such a great way of sort of thinking about the balance between the two. Yes, we have rights for so many things and we fight for, and I think especially when we have the right to protest, for example, but we also have the responsibilities that come in with that protest, making sure everybody is safe, making sure everybody is, it's not disrupting other people who aren't part of the protest. It's not being mean towards anybody, or it's not being nasty towards, it's still having that respect between the other side who don't really know about the protest, or don't really know what the protest is for. it's also making the protest seem in a positive light as well, I think is a very important part that we tend to forget when it comes to protests, of making sure that everybody still remembers what that protest is for, rather than this protest getting out of hand and everybody just thinking about it negatively. I think one of the greatest examples for me is the recent climate change protests that's been happening, and people throwing paint on the on artwork in museums and trying to make a name for the protest, trying to make a name for climate change. And I think we forget, yes, you have the right to protest, but you also have the responsibility of making sure that you do it in a respectful way.
Yes, that's a very good point. And we have to exercise our rights to protest, but we also have to exercise our duty to listen to criticism of our protest. Mm-hmm. And we have to be careful not to slip into a relativist way of thinking and acting. Now, what do I mean by relativist? I mean unprincipled. I mean rejecting the idea that there are principles of right and wrong. Okay. In some areas, we have slipped into relativism, and I think one of the reasons why the arts and humanities are suffering in universities, why there has been a decline of support, is actually because there's been a slippage into relativism. And this is the fault of adults. It's not students. It's not the students. It's the adults making the mistake. If you go to some of the major English literature departments right now, the courses they teach reflect relativism. They have forgotten that certain literature is better than others, and they find it difficult to defend classical literature. They become defensive about why should we teach Jane Austen or Shakespeare. They find that something difficult. And so what we've slipped into is a situation where relativism is ruling. And I think that younger people have recognized there's a problem here, and they're actually staying away from those departments. Mm-hmm. And we have a situation where universities are actually losing the interest of the young in those areas, which is a great shame, because those are the exact areas that we need to study.
Yes, no, I agree. And I think there's a lot that we can learn, and there's a lot that we're still needing to learn with finding that responsibility that sort of takes place. And I wanted to ask, when it comes to political opinions that may be varying within a household, and I know that it's very common, especially in today's society, in today's culture, how can parents and even families themselves sort of handle those differing political opinions within that household to create an environment where you can have that healthy discussion without it getting out of hand?
Yes, this has become more common, and it is extremely difficult to deal with within families. And I believe one way to deal with it is for each person to try hard outside the household to listen, to read material that they disagree with profoundly. Mm-hmm. For example, every week I spend a number of hours reading extremist material that I find disagreeable. I listen to extremist radio shows and podcasts. Now, the reason I do this is because I want to learn about points of view that are very different from my own. And this is important within the family, to listen to different points of view, not within the family, but from outside, and to say, well, listen, here is a white nationalist who is saying these things. Let's try to understand, why is this person saying these things? I know we might disagree with that person. Or here is an extremist Muslim who's advocating violence in this way. We disagree with this person, but can we understand why this person is saying these things? If we approach it that way, the debates within the family become framed within a larger world, and it becomes less personal. It's not, oh, my dad thinks this and I think he's wrong and I'm going to just dismiss him. It becomes a debate about the larger world, and our views fit into that larger world. But the method I'm advocating is extremely difficult. I accept that, because in human relationships, there's a very strong principle of similarity attraction. We are attracted to others who are similar to us. We find it disagreeable to come across people who are dissimilar and disagree with us all the time. Mm-hmm. So it's very difficult to do this, but try it. Listen to a radio show that is expressing views that you completely disagree with, and try to understand, where are they coming from?
No, that's a very good way of approaching a lot of conflicting sort of points that sort of come up. And there's one thing that me and my friends love to do, where we come with it's kind of called debate prep, where we look at both sides of the argument in the terms of the way that a debate would. And that's the way that we sort of try to argue for or against something, sort of list the pros and cons of both sides of that point of view and certain issues. And that creates such a open-minded view, because growing up, culturally, there's a lot of views that you grow up, like you said, you grow up very similar with the community that you're in, and you sort of see one side of the coin. But as you get older, I feel like it's pretty much up to us to find both sides and see what side that we truly agree with, especially as we get out of the community into the wider world. And so that's the way that my friends and I have found to be the best way to sort of deal with the different conflicting issues and find out which side that we agree with, which side we don't, rather than just seeing one side and agreeing with that rather than seeing the other side.
Yes, that's a very good method. One of the reasons why there is more conflict and disagreement within the family is because the family is not isolated. It is integral to the rest of society. And at the moment, we have what I call mutual radicalization. Mutual radicalization is when groups and nations push each other to more and more extreme positions. And I believe mutual radicalization has happened in American politics. Mm-hmm. It has also happened in different parts of the world. For example, in the Middle East. In the Middle East, we have mutual radicalization between extremist Muslims and extremist Jews. And these two polar opposites have pushed each other to more and more extreme positions, and the middle ground is hollowed out. Well, the same is happening in American politics. We have these extremist groups pushing each other to more extreme positions. And if you look at the middle, there are tens of millions of Americans who feel disenfranchised. They say, well, nobody is speaking for us, the middle group. And of course, this is reflected in the family. The family is not isolated from these movements. The family is very much affected by them. And so we have this same process within the family. And one way to change and get out of this is to reflect by thinking about extremist positions, not within the family, but in the outside world, and starting from that position.
No, that's really good. That's a really good point. And sort of creating that that decision to be open with the rest of the family as well, to sort of allow that space of where everyone feels comfortable to disagree. I think that's a really important part to it.
Yes, and it is our duty to listen to the disagreement and to the opposite view.
Without getting angry.
Yes.
I think that's a big part. So when it comes to some practical steps, so what are some practical steps and activities that parents can really implement on the daily to make those conversations a little bit more comfortable and a safe environment for everyone?
Parents can never do enough of one thing, and that one thing is constantly ask young people, their children, about their lives, ask them about their relationships, how they are feeling, if they have problems, etc. So asking and explaining and communicating. Now, I know this is extremely difficult because research tells us that when people are under stress, parents, when they are under stress, they tend to provide either no explanation or briefer explanations. And we know that parents are under stress because we have, when there are two parents, they're both typically working. They're under stress because they're working long hours. And so the tendency is for the parent to say, do this. And the child says, well, why? And the parent says, well, look, I don't have time to explain. You know, that's the typical response. I don't have time. So either they say that or they provide a very brief explanation. One way to cope with this problem is to leave some space and some time every day, or at least every week. Sometimes it has to be every week because people are so hectic in their lives. And to say, in this half an hour, we're going to sit down and talk about what has happened this week, and whatever explanation you want from me, I'm going to provide it. So leaving some space for that, because when you look at people's lives, it's so hectic, it's so rushed, that often parents use their authority, their power, to be dismissive and to say, oh, no time for that, let's go, we have to get this done. And I'm not going to explain to you why, we just have to do it. So leaving some time, some space for explanations. Now, the child may not accept the explanation, but at least it is there, it is provided, it is reasoned out. And that's important. And often, particularly when you get to authoritative parenting, what you find is that style of parenting provides explanations, and children often say, well, I don't agree with it, but I know you love me, and so on. You know, there's a relationship that builds upwards, rather than an authoritarian relationship where the parent says, you know, you either do this or you're grounded, or I'm going to whack you, or something like that.
Yeah, no, I think there is definitely a huge difference in how parents can approach a situation. They sort of can approach those conversations. And those parenting styles seem like they are very effective in so many different ways that sort of damage or build a relationship that can be positive or negative.
Yes. Now, there are variations. For example, some researchers have talked about a permissive style of parenting, which is having few boundaries, having few rules, and it tends to be a situation where the child is left with, I think, too much freedom often, and then the child has to set their own boundaries, which they often make mistakes on. So that's one problem. And then another kind of parenting is a kind of neglectful parenting, where the child is just not given enough attention in any way. And there is lack of emotional relationship and connection with the child. The child has to feel emotionally connected to the parent, and some parents fail to do this. In the original research on the authoritarian personality, it was discovered that the authoritarian personality emerges from a family where the father is a kind of mini dictator, an authoritarian figure, very harsh, and the mother is very much a recluse and emotionally unconnected to the child. So there are patterns of relationships that from the early research, people thought these connect to authoritarian personality style. We have to remember that it's not just the father or the mother or just the children. It's this interaction, the dynamics of relationships within the family.
Yeah.
Now, the psychiatrist R.D. Laing wrote about this and researched it in terms of politics in the family. And one of his arguments was that when you have mental health problems, when a child becomes depressed, or you have other mental health problems within the family, you have to understand this child's depression or other problems within the dynamics of politics in the family. The child arrives in this world completely helpless, and is dependent on adults. If the relationship between the adults is dysfunctional, this dysfunction is transferred onto the relationship between adults and children. And you cannot have a healthy child growing up in a home where the relationships are dysfunctional from the beginning. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
So Lang's argument was that mental health arises out of the politics of the family.
Yeah. No, that's very true. I think, especially when it comes to the impact that a parent's opinion can make on a child, if they have differing opinions, there's a lot that sort of takes place when it comes to that as well. The respect that sort of comes in, like, you're an adult, maybe I should listen to what you say rather than what I think. So there's a lot of differing opinions that can sort of create that imbalance of a child's autonomy as well.
Yes, and often it's simply a power ratio. The parent has more power and the child doesn't have a choice.
Yeah, no, that's very true. So when we're looking into the next part of our show, which is the last section, which is the open mic, this sort of gets you to talk about something that you are passionate about, that you want to share with our audience. And I know that there is something that you're wanting to promote on our show today as well. So I'd love to give you that minute or so and share what's on your mind.
One of the themes of the 21st century is change, and people attempting to bring about the kind of change that they see to be necessary. And as a psychologist, I'm particularly interested in the psychology of change. What changes are possible? And I've published a book on what I call political plasticity. That is, how malleable is political behavior? How far is it possible to change it? And my next book is on the psychology of revolution, which is coming out next month, The Psychology of Revolution. And I focus on this question of change. How much change do revolutions actually bring about? And my argument has been that actually, if you look at the major revolutions, starting with the French Revolution, and I look particularly at the French, Russian, Chinese, Cuban, and Iranian revolutions, and I asked, what changes do they actually bring about? And the traditional approach has been to say, well, look at what led to the revolution and the regime change. But I don't stop there, because for me, the most important change comes after the revolution. After regime change, what did they manage to change after that? And it turns out, if you look at after regime change, revolutions achieve very little change indeed. The deep kinds of change we're interested in don't happen in the short term. They happen in the long term and very slowly. And to give an example, I focus on leader-follower relationships. And I argue that actually, if you look at leader-follower relationships, they've been extremely rigid, and change has come very slowly over the last 10, 12,000 years, for example. Almost all of our leaders have been older males, and they've been dictatorial in style. Now, we've changed the style of leadership in the United States, but the next presidential election is going to be competed over by two basically 80-year-old men. We have not managed to change leadership style very much. We have the same pattern of leader-follower relationships. So my passion these days is to look at the types of change we can achieve and ask, why is it that in other areas we can't achieve change quickly? I'm going to end with some good news. There are areas of change that come more rapidly and more positively. To give an example, women in higher education. At most of the major universities, women were not even allowed into university until recently. And look at the change we have achieved. The majority of students are now women, and most of the young faculty in most departments are women. Within another 20 years, my own department will be 90% women. So how have we achieved that change? That's an important question. And I think we've achieved that change by not emphasizing differences. We have not said, let's celebrate the differences between men and women. We have said, men and women can compete. Let's give them a level playing field. They are very, very similar in abilities. They can compete. And that has been our success. And I call that omniculturalism rather than multiculturalism.
Okay. No, I love that. And so this is a book that is coming out soon, or is already out?
The book on the psychology of revolution is coming out in March.
Okay.
And political plasticity is already out.
Okay, perfect. And will it be out on Amazon, or is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, it's already on Amazon and available. And political plasticity is already on Amazon.
Okay, perfect. I'll find those and I'll put those in the description down below for everyone who wants to find out a little bit more about the book, easy access to it. Now, if our listeners want to find out a little bit more about you, is there a place that I can send them to?
Yes, I have a website, FathaliMoghaddam.com.
Okay, perfect. I'll add that down below as well.
Right.
So thank you so much, Fathali, for joining me on the show today. I actually really enjoyed our discussion and talking a lot about the rules and responsibilities, the rights and responsibilities that come along with trying to be a bit more active in civic engagement. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It was my pleasure, and good luck with your shows. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And I hope you guys learned as much as I did when it comes to the rules and responsibilities that are meant to come in when we're trying to protest, when trying to stand for what we believe in, and also how to be a bit more engaged within a family that create a safe environment. So I thank you everyone for joining me today, and I'll see you all in the next episode. You've been listening to Raising Parents, the Parenting Science Insights podcast, produced by the Parenting Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so that we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at pa.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Dina Sargeant. Thanks for tuning in.